get back to this. So this is where we ended. For some reason, I don't know, actually I'm surprised I don't get this mixed up more often. I thought I was further ahead, so I'm going to have to change the, actually I need to get back to this. Do, do, do. Yeah, that's completely wrong. Oh, yeah, there we go. Actually, I can fix that. Chapter 20. Part 2. I thought we were much further along. Okay. Good. So, we were talking about the War of 1898, which is to say the Spanish-American War, kind of. It's more just like Cuba was fighting for its independence, and we got involved because we felt like it. Let's say we felt like it. We wanted to be involved in Cuba's independence because we realized, hey, we can get some money out of this, which is really cynical, but you know, it was the 1800s, and there was a lot of cynicism happening in the world, and I mean that was the whole like imperialism thing of let's just like get involved in other countries and just ignore their sovereignty for the sake of making money. So this was the time of the Rough Riders, Teddy Roosevelt, all that. We mentioned this briefly before, but this was, you know, the actual war part of that. Here we have, you know, charging up San Juan Hill and fighting the Spanish. There wasn't a whole lot of that, despite, you know, of course, there being a lot of images, because obviously there was a lot more images being taken by the American reporters when the Americans were involved, despite us only being there 4 months. So yeah, 460 Americans died in combat, despite 5,000 dying due to disease, because again, we weren't quite prepared for fighting in the near-tropical jungles of Cuba. We also got Puerto Rico and Guam and gained occupation of the Philippines, which I'll get into more in a little bit. And we'll also watch a video at the end. Normally I'd show it here when we talk about the Philippines, but again, we've got the online class, and I doubt YouTube would appreciate me watching a video on YouTube and streaming it onto YouTube. I don't think they would like that very much. So we'll just watch it at the end, and I'll post that link to my online students, for those of them that can actually get into Blackboard right now. So speaking of, speaking of Cuba, before the war, well, I say before the war began, the war had begun. Before America even got involved in the war, the Teller Amendment was adopted to the Pledge to Aid Cuba, in that it would only be allowed self-rule after pacification, which again, as I said in the previous class, it wasn't that we're going to help Cuba be independent of Spain and then go on our merry way. We would aid Cuba's independence until it was pacified. There was no, like, Spain-specific language there. So due to, of course, racism, Americans believed that the Cuban rebels hadn't really done anything, despite them having fought, like, the majority of the war. Well, white commanding officers also, of course, were shocked at the number of Afro-Cubans who were in leadership positions, which is to say, also a lot of them. This is a quote from one U.S. commanding officer, and again, this is not speaking of the people they were fighting. This is him talking about the people they were going to help. This is him talking about the allies. Well, I mean, their allies in this war. And I quote, the typical Cuban I encountered was a treacherous, lying, cowardly, thieving, worthless, half-breed mongrel, born of a mongrel spawn of Spain, crossed upon the fetches of darkest Africa and aboriginal America. Not the kindest word for the people we were going to help. I mean, that'd be like us going over in, World War I and World War II and talking about how the French were like backward subhuman monsters. It's like, I mean, we give the French crap anyway, but like, okay. So U.S. officials felt Cuba was unfit for self-rule. It remained under U.S. military occupation until 1902. Again, despite being free of Spain in 1898, Cuba adopted a document based on the U.S. Constitution. Basically, Cuba created its own constitution. Of course, though, strings were attached. The Platt Amendment of 1901 limited Cuban sovereignty. Cuba was prohibited from signing foreign treaties without the U.S. being involved. And America could intervene in Cuba anytime they wanted to preserve independence and remove threats to economic stability. And also, this is when we got Guantanamo Bay, because, that's always a good thing. A naval base where laws don't matter. So technically, the occupation ended in 1901, but Cuba was not a truly independent nation. It was a U.S. protectorate, which allowed for the U.S. to really kind of do whatever. Protectorate is technically not a colony. It's a weird kind of middle ground. Like, we've got some territories still today, like the U.S. Virgin Islands, Puerto Rico, actually a number of Caribbean islands, as well as Pacific islands, that aren't states. They're territories, where, like, they still pay taxes to the U.S., and they technically belong to the U.S., but they can't vote. Like, they're not involved in electoral processes. So they're not U.S. citizens technically, but they're still under the jurisdiction of the U.S. Like, it's this weird gray area. A protectorate's even worse in that we get all the benefits of them being part of the U.S. and that we get all the tax money and whatnot. But they get none of the benefits. Like, they get no kind of government aid at all. Yeah, it's a protectorate's not a good, it's not a way you want, not a position you want to be in. What's up?
The local territories, if I recall correctly, it's that they can't vote on their island, or if they're on the territory, but if they're on the mainland, they can vote.
Okay.
If I remember from my classes correctly.
Yeah, it's a weird gray area. So here's the U.S. troops rolling in Havana, the American Army of Occupation, because again, we occupied Cuba for several years. It's no wonder that, like, as soon as the USSR was like, hey, you guys want to maybe tell America to shove off? They're like, hey, sure. And here's some of the cartoons of the day: Cuba, Puerto Rico, Philippine Islands, Sandwich Islands, which is more Pacific stuff. I'll actually give Oh, I did already show you guys how far west this went. Here again is Teddy's policies. I'll show more of that in a little bit. So this is a really good representation of how many of the American officials and Americans in general at the time saw how they were treating Cuba. America was this benevolent, like, overseer, this parent, looking over Cuba, Cubans were, as we're going to see with the Philippines as well, they were seen as children who couldn't take care of themselves, and this idea of a protectorate was letting them walk on their own, but we're there in case they need us. You know, not the actual economic exploitation that the protectorate was. So it says here at the bottom, the first steps alone, while you can see here around the child Cuba's waist, U.S. protectorate, despite Cuba existing like long before the American colonies, but you know, whatever. So here we have prosperity at home, prestige abroad. Again, this all happened within McKinley's term, the 1 year he was in power before he was shot. Because this took 4 months. So again, this was the idea, save me from my friends. If the Cuban rebels were to win, then it would be terrible in Cuba or whatever. All right. So let's go on to the other side of the world, because there was more going on than just Cuba. The book doesn't really go into Guam or Puerto Rico. It just mentions that Spain ceded them to the U.S., though we do have that one bit of propaganda where it's talking about, like, America fighting Spain in Guam. But the book only mentions Cuba and the Philippines. And the main reason it mentions the Philippines isn't really Spain, it's the Filipinos. So let's get into that. Before we had even invaded Cuba, the U.S. had already hit the Philippines. As the war began, the U.S. Pacific Fleet, under the command of Commodore George Dewey, hit the Spanish flotilla in Manila Bay on May 1st and pretty much just wiped it out. 400 Spanish sailors were killed and only 8 Americans received minor injuries. And I wonder how one can have a flotilla battle where 400 Spanish sailors are killed and 8 American sailors receive minor injuries, not even like are killed or like are wounded and have to go to, the hospital. They have minor injuries, like did they get smoke inhalation from all the cannons, or they get overheated from running around on deck, or get salt water in their eyes from the splashing nearby. Like, what does that even mean? Anyway, 2.5 months later, American forces actually invaded Manila, which again, Manila being the capital of the Philippines, and the Spanish forces just surrendered. Like, there wasn't even really a war in the Philippines, at least against the Spanish. All set. Thank you. Okay. So, as soon as this happened, imperialists wanted to annex the Philippines into the U.S., and I think until like really recently, the Philippines were, I don't think the Philippines are still a U.S. territory. I'm not sure. They wanted to annex the Philippines like as a major part of the U.S., like we had done with Hawaii, as a staging post for economic exploitation of China. Because as I showed you guys on that map, the Philippines are like just south of China. They're really close to China, and Yeah, I mean, just like from a just like a geographical standpoint, that would be the way to go. Of course, just like with Cuba, there was this racial reasoning behind why America should be involved. The Filipino people could not guard themselves, despite them having done so for centuries, if not millennia. Um, the Indiana Senator Albert Beveridge, I don't know why a man with that name thought he could make this statement, but whatever. We must never forget that in dealing with the Filipinos, we deal with children. That was the mindset of the day. Not everybody was on board with this. We had individuals like Andrew Carnegie, Jane Addams, Mark Twain, and labor organizer Samuel Gompers, who isn't really mentioned anywhere else in the book, but he's involved here. They founded the Anti-Imperialist League. Now, these arguments for why we shouldn't be imperialist ranged all across the board. Some folks believe that this violated America's anti-colonial heritage because, it did. The idea that we were colonies once and we broke away from an empire, and now we are like taking colonies and overruling other people's sovereignty kind of flies in the face of the whole reason we broke away from an empire in the first place. And of course, if Andrew Carnegie is involved, then of course there's economic concerns. There's this idea that, which is something we talk about in greater detail in my 1 at 4 course, but there's this idea that spreading out too much is actually more economically taxing than it is enriching, which is the case. Like, taking land all over the world, Britain is a really good example of this, is actually really expensive. Like, in some cases, sure, you can take land and make a lot of money off of it. Britain is an example of that. And in some cases, taking land is really expensive because you have to administer that land, and you have to take care of the people there, and you have to make sure that the people aren't going to rebel, and you've got to build roads and railways and yada yada yada. Britain's a really good example of that because Britain's had an empire all over the world at one point, and it becomes more and more difficult the further you spread out. Also, though, the Filipinos themselves were not at all happy with trading one imperialist master for another. And they fought back. And it was bad. And the video I'm going to show you guys at the end of class goes into far greater detail than the book does when it comes to just how bad it was. The book does mention it to some degree. U.S. forces responded in kind, adopting harsh methods to suppress the uprising. General Jacob H. Smithee ordered his troops to kill and burn, and the more you kill and burn, the better you please me. Of course, things were racist. Counterinsurgency efforts, which indiscriminately targeted combatants and civilians alike. Estimated 200,000 Filipino civilians died between 1899 and 1902. It was extremely bad, and it got to the point of which we'll see again in the video in greater detail, where they were just rounding up people and putting them in concentration camps, and anybody that wasn't in the concentration camps were considered insurgents and killed. So if you refused to be rounded up and put in a concentration camp, you were shot. And that eventually ended up breaking the insurgency. But it's mentioned in the book that by July of 1901/1902, that the war was over, and it kind of was, but the war shifted. A new group took over the war, and it continued until like 1912. It continued another 10 years. This war was the longest war America had ever had up until Afghanistan. And it's one that you rarely ever hear about. Excuse me, you rarely ever hear about. And, like, it was full of atrocities, full of war crimes, full of just, like, entire islands being killed down to the last man, woman, and child. And, yeah, it was bad. It was real bad. This was also when the M1911 was issued to soldiers, because after the 1911 or 1901 and the Bolo part of the war began, this would be when the soldiers would be ambushed by combatants with bolo knives, these large, broad knives that would just charge into the soldiers and begin hacking at them, and they took a lot of fire to take down. And so they were issued these larger caliber semi-automatic pistols, the M1911, which was specifically issued to fight the Bolos. So yeah, it was a really horrible war that took a lot longer than most historians actually talk about, if you talk about it at all. So, there's the very brief fight with the Spanish. And then it just goes into, like, jungle warfare against the Filipinos for like a decade and a half. And then you have this sort of thing. Senate Philippine bill offers great inducements to the bad Filipino. So you have the bad Filipino down here. There's the bolo knife. And then the good Filipino here accepting American rule as seen as being more civilized and, not like a freaking caveman. Also, though, you'd have just like mass graves, because Americans were real good at filling mass graves. We saw plenty of that with the Native Americans. Oh yeah, we also had all sorts of fun forms of torture. This is like waterboarding, but worse. This was called the water cure, where we just pour water down their throat until they either confessed or drowned. The Maxim gun existed at this point, so we were gunning people down with, like, essentially machine guns. Next is the garrote, which was, like, a form of execution, apparently. A very slow form of execution. Here's a good one. So this is not a poem per se. Lucky Filipinos. It appears the Filipinos have lost confidence in Americans. Do the benighted wretches fail to realize that what we have accomplished in their islands? We have burnt certain villages, destroyed considerable property, and incidentally slaughtered a few thousand of their sons and brothers, husbands and fathers, etc. But what did they expect? Were we to transport an army more than halfway across the earth merely to listen to peace propositions? Not much. And look at Manila. 2 years ago, the main street of Manila did not possess a single saloon. Now there are 13 in this one street. And they complain that drunken American soldiers insult the native women. Again, insult being a euphemism for something far worse than saying bad words. What do they expect from a drunken soldier anyway? Progress is now in these islands. She may be red-handed and at times drunk, but she is there for business. So, we're the good guys. Anyway, on to something slightly less war crimey. Teddy Roosevelt. So McKinley was assassinated in 1901, as we well know. Teddy Roosevelt took up the mantle of imperialism because, he was all about that stuff. Believed in using power to secure American economic interests to the point of force if necessary. Now, that said, the actual idea of, taking lands for America had ended with the Philippines. Everything post-Philippines was just we'll be involved economically, but we're not actually going to go in and take land anymore because this was bad. Now, granted, again, the Philippines took 15 years to actually fully pacify, so it's going throughout all of this, and even throughout Wilson's. So, Mahan considered a canal across Central America. U.S. signed the Hay-Paunchfote Treaty with Britain, gave America America the right to build the canal, not access. They selected Panama because the French had begun a project but ran out of money, because that's going to happen a lot. Ironically, the same thing happens in Suez a little bit later. France began the Suez Canal and then ran out of money. And Britain's like, I guess we're going to finish this up. So we got permission from Britain to get involved there. I don't know why we had to get permission from Britain, but whatever. I guess because they're the big naval power. We bought the project that France has started for $40 million because they needed the money. We also needed to negotiate with Colombia, who technically owned the land, which again, why was Britain involved? I don't get why Britain was involved at all, but whatever. So Colombia technically owned the land at the time. Panama wasn't an independent nation. So they reached an agreement, but the Colombian government decided that they could make more money if they held out. So they refused to ratify it and wanted America to pay more because they realized that this was a real important deal for America, and if America was desperate, then America would cough up more money. However, in 1903, there was a pro-American uprising in Panama, which totally, for sure, absolutely was not at all caused by, American agents that went into Panama and stirred that up. Certainly not. So America supported this uprising by sending warships in to blockade the port, which made it so that Colombia couldn't send their own troops in to put down this uprising. So we didn't send troops in to help them. We just made it so that Colombia couldn't go in to put the rebellion down. So once again, we're interfering with countries' internal disputes for our own benefit. Roosevelt immediately recognized the new government of Panama because, again, when countries have their rebellions, they need to be recognized by outside nations for it to be official, and this was in our best interest, so that's what Roosevelt did. Signed a treaty that allowed the U.S. to build the canal and exercise power and authority over it. So while technically the canal was Panama's, this treaty made it so that the U.S. had authority over the canal. It took about 10 years to finish the canal. The Panama Canal was a major undertaking when it comes to infrastructure and really just engineering. I've watched a whole 2-hour documentary on the building of the Panama Canal, and it's amazing that it got done. I mean, even today, it would be a major engineering undertaking. And it was I mean, even today, it's still a huge deal. And we saw what the Suez Canal being blocked did to the world economy. This thing being blocked would be just as bad, if not worse. So Roosevelt was so chuffed with himself over the Panama Canal that he declared a Roosevelt corollary on top of the Monroe Doctrine. Monroe Doctrine, again, recall, was that we wouldn't mess with Europe's stuff as long as Europe didn't get involved with stuff here in the Western Hemisphere. But now Roosevelt was saying that the U.S. had the right to intervene with anything going on in the Western Hemisphere, because we already had been. But he was just now stating it, that like this was just how things should be. Not that we don't get involved everywhere else now, but we were starting small. And here's some really great images of Teddy Roosevelt as this like massive man coming in to dig the canal himself. So here he's coming into Panama to help in this massive GOP ship. And there's, I think that's supposed to be Taft up there with his little revolvers. There was a lot of conspiracies behind what actually was going on. You've got French canal stock, intrigue, concessions to the United States for the canal. Apparently, a minister to the U.S. was part of this. Like there was a lot going on behind the scenes. How much of it was just like conjecture and conspiracy, I don't know, but it was not at all just Panama just so happened to rebel when America could use that. Here's Teddy Roosevelt as like I lost the lumberjack's name. Paul Bunyan? Just like digging the canal himself. And here we have Panama bus going over precedent, Columbia protests, international law. I mean, they broke a lot of laws with this thing. But it didn't matter. It's another giant Teddy Roosevelt. Here we go. Here's actual Teddy Roosevelt down on the canal in one of these big steam-powered earth movers. And here's the canal being built. So you've got these big earth movers up here, these trolleys that would come through and help like dredge it out. It was a process. Also, a lot of people died building this thing. I mean, it was the 1800s. You couldn't dig a ditch without people dying. But part of the reason was all this lovely stagnant water, and the fact that they're down in Panama, lots of mosquitoes, lots of malaria, lots of, well, not just malaria, lots of other various tropical diseases. It killed a lot of folks. So here's some of the bigger parts being built. Those are the locks. And here it is completed. And a lot of the thing about the Panama Canal compared to the Suez is that a lot of it is actual, shouldn't point with my hand. A lot of it is actual natural waterways. So they would come in and shut the locks off and raise the water level to the level of the lakes, and then you go through and like take the river through to the next lock, and it would adjust because you actually would go up over like this mountain in the middle of this part of Panama to get to the other side. All right. So another major focus of American imperialism was, of course, China. Now, while this, of course, fell out of the whole Western Hemisphere thing, all Western powers were involved in China, and America wanted to be involved in this open door policy that other European powers were pushing, largely through the Opium Wars. We had been somewhat involved in the Second Opium War, but we really got our hands in things with the Boxer Rebellion. What year was that? 1905, it says here. No, that's 1900. In 1905 is the Russo-Japanese War. Yeah, the Boxer Rebellion was actually a pretty major event in China due to the previous Opium Wars and the Chinese government basically crumbling to the Western powers. There was a nationalist uprising in China to try and throw off the Western powers and really overthrow the government. And the government actually couldn't put down the Boxer Rebellion. So Western powers came in to put down the rebellion in order to maintain control over China. And then after putting down the rebellion, they basically told China they had to pay the Western powers all this money. So it ended up hurting the government even more. The China was this punching bag for about a century and a half there. Also, there was this event in Japan. We mentioned the Russo-Japanese War before, but this is more specifically. Russia invaded China's province of Manchuria. Of course, China did not have the power to actually do anything about that. And also, Japan was at the point that they were so powerful that they also considered Manchuria part of their sphere of influence. Technically, it was China's, but Japan considered it their property. So when Russia moved in, Japan got pissed and pushed in to take. It was Port Arthur. Port Arthur was the start of the Russo-Japanese War. And at first, everybody just expected Russia to beat Japan. But there were two major issues. One, the Japanese government, military was a lot stronger than anybody was prepared for, much less Russia. Also, this was on the eastern side of Russia, which is to say on the other side of Siberia. So they had to move all their troops across Siberia to get to the front. And the Trans-Siberian Railroad wasn't done yet. So that was a nightmare. By the end of the war, they very nearly they almost had their Bolshevik Revolution early. That's how bad this war went for Russia. So with Japan winning so handily, Roosevelt sought to limit their gains because he believed that Russia being completely pushed out of that region would, quote, cause a real shifting of equilibrium as far as the white races are concerned. Because while most Europeans didn't want Russia to get too much power, especially in Europe, there was a whole war about that, they certainly didn't want Russia to lose out to an Oriental power. We can't have that. So he called a peace conference in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. Japan was given Korea and parts of Manchuria because, we'll just give them land that doesn't belong to them and not worry about the people who live there. But they had to support the United States open door policy in China because, again, we're not going to bother asking China about that. And this was considered a diplomatic victory for America, so Roosevelt sent his 16 battleships around the world as a show of force. Look how much peace I can do. Here's my battleships. Turn of the century was weird. So after Roosevelt, Taft did exist. He preferred his dollars for bullets, or dollar diplomacy as he called it. He encouraged bankers to invest in the Caribbean and Central America rather than sending in the Marines. This doubled American investments in the region. However, he still did have to end up sending in Marines. 1909, American fruit and mining companies installed a sympathetic government in Nicaragua because the companies were so strong they could just overthrow the government. We just literally let the companies do whatever they wanted, and they overthrew the government. Well, the people of Nicaragua didn't appreciate that, and they rebelled, and rather than be like, wow, maybe we shouldn't overthrow governments for the sake of economic power, instead we sent in U.S. troops to quell the rebellion of a nation that we took over because of a couple of companies. So, Hey. Awesome. Pretend like you're having a good time, guys. Anyway. We do have Collier's magazine here, again, with the war in China, although it feels like they pulled a lot of Japanese imagery here, but it's the early 1900s, so they're not going to really tell the difference. But having taken a higher level China course, the Boxer Rebellion was a bigger deal than we're going to be able to learn in this course. This image I've got for my European history course, which is all the European powers fighting over essentially the corpse of China, where all the powers are represented by their nation's what would you say, patron animal. So of course the Chinese dragon. We've got the Italian wolf, which is kind of cool. Usually don't get to see Italy doing anything neat. Britain is a lion here. Russia really doesn't need the sash. Russia's the bear. Germany here. Austria is the two-headed vulture because of the dual monarchy. What do we have? Oh, yeah, France is a rooster. Let's just go with that. And then, of course, America here. Not that it makes us look like we weren't really involved, but we 100% were. Then also, whatever's happening here, with the various leaders. Actually, I think I've got a better one. There's this, which is also weird because, like, it was happening in China. They weren't, like, murdering American citizens. They were fighting other Chinese. So we have, again, America in China. Acting like we were the only ones, fighting in the Boxer Rebellion. But, this propaganda stuff is great. And then the Russo-Japanese War. So France was technically allied with Russia at the time. It says on here, France, keep it up, Russia, you're winning. And Russia says, well, if this is winning, what will you do if I lose? This is also the time of a really funny, well, I say funny, it was a really terrible Navy expedition by Russia. Russia's Pacific Fleet had been destroyed at Port Arthur. So they sent their Baltic Fleet around the world, because they weren't allowed to go through the Suez Canal, around the tip of Africa, all the way up and across to try to fight Japan. And it was a disaster. I can't go into great detail because it will be the rest of class. But it was amazing. They had zero gunnery ability. They nearly sank each other multiple times. They nearly went to war with Britain a couple of times because they shot at British ships thinking they were Japanese U-boats. The Japanese didn't have U-boats. They picked up animals in Madagascar and nearly got hunted by, like, the wild animals that they picked up in Madagascar. And then when they got to Japan, they were immediately sunk. It was a really bad expedition. It's a really good video. You guys should check it out. Anyway, here's the peace thing. There's the Great White Fleet, not the Russian fleet I just mentioned. Not at all. They couldn't keep a line. There's Monroe Doctrine. There's Monroe Doctrine in the Roosevelt Corollary if you needed a visual representation of that. Keep your hands off. We got cannons. All right. I'm going to go a little bit more and then we'll do the video. So, as we mentioned, Wilson was essentially the polar opposite of Roosevelt in how he wanted to do policy. He no longer wanted to use the big stick diplomacy, but he ended up doing a lot of Roosevelt stuff anyway. Used Marines to protect American interests in Haiti, the Dominican Republic, and Cuba. And then Mexico had a revolution in 1911. Now, normally that wouldn't be a big deal because Mexico is doing its own thing. And that's fine. However, apparently Mexico refused to put leaders in power that Wilson wanted because it was Wilson's business apparently. So Wilson sent the U.S. Navy to Veracruz to force them to put leaders in power that he wanted. This led to a clash, killed 19 Americans and 126 Mexicans, which led to General Francisco Pancho Villa sending 1,500 troops over the border to attack Columbus, New Mexico. So Wilson, in response, sent General John Pershing and 10,000 troops 300 miles into Mexico to try to capture Villa, which resulted in nothing. Pershing just like wandered through the Mexican desert for weeks and months and got nothing accomplished, just ended up pissing off Mexico more and more. This all over Mexico having its own revolution, installing a government that Wilson didn't like, and we very nearly had a war over it. Meanwhile, over in Europe, they were not about to. They were starting World War One. Austrian Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated, and World War One started. Central powers, Germany, Ottoman Empire, and Austria-Hungary, declared war on the Allies. Technically, it was the Entente, but this isn't 104. You guys don't need to worry about that. Great Britain, France, and Russia. So we had all of Europe fighting all of Europe. Technically, America was neutral for the first 3 years, but Wilson considered the idea of a British defeat, quote, fatal to our form of government and American ideals. So while we technically weren't involved in the war, we really didn't want Britain to lose. We also had peace activists, Jane Addams, Carrie Chapman Catt, who organized the Women's Peace Party. But even then, one of the leaders, Lucia True Ames Mead, middle names here, stated there can be no peace until the military domination of Germany is destroyed. So again, like, we're neutral, but also we got to destroy Germany. So yeah, that was where our neutrality was at the start of World War One. Which we tried really hard to stay neutral. Well, I'll say we tried really hard. We were neutral for a while, really until the last year. So we've got our view of the Mexican Revolution, not real flattering. Mexican policy, add some pepper, which is to say force, because that certainly worked. Uncle Sam with a horrifying face. I just about enough of this. Technically, it's the Mexican thing started under Taft, so here he is handing it off to Wilson. There's a Pershing expedition. I love Villa's hat. Look at that with a snake curled around it. That's pretty cool. Wilson steering us out of war. Vote for Wilson, who kept you out of war. This is 1916, the re-election. It says here, what's that? U-boats blockading New York? Tut tut, very inopportune. Needless to say, U-boats never made it to the U.S. Peace in America, God bless Wilson. We'll talk more about that next time. So let's quickly get that video I want to show you guys. And that means that the stream needs to end, because we cannot watch the video on stream. Where is my... Alright. It's like, why can't I bring the thing down? Because my